UFO sightings in space are a very rare thing indeed, and UFO sightings that don't turn out to be satellites or some sort of object intentionally launched from the International Space Station are even more rare than that. And what is perhaps the rarest type of sighting is a UFO sighting that takes place in orbit that can also be confirmed from the ground. As far as I know, there's only a couple of those types of incidents, and all of them are pretty obscure. For example, a sighting made by a Russian cosmonaut on the ISS in 2020, which was explained away as being a Starlink sighting, even though this little grouping of lights in the sky does not correspond to any sort of Starlink sightings that I could pull up, and also there were no Starlink launches on that particular day. And then to add further confirmation to this incident, the same grouping of lights were seen from an observer in Australia on the same day in 2020. As you can see, this time exposure photograph revealed the same grouping of lights moving through the sky, briefly visible and then not. And again, the reason that would have happened is if these were objects that briefly turned or rotated so that the sun caught their solar panels or perhaps a flat reflective surface, then they might be briefly visible. But that does not correspond to a Starlink sighting at all. It's just too brief and seems to indicate, at least to me, objects that rotated or changed their configuration briefly, and that's why they caught the sunlight and then disappeared just as rapidly. But what we don't have, well, perhaps until now, is a sighting of objects in space and a corresponding sighting of the same objects in the atmosphere at a different time. Something like that would be a huge breakthrough in the whole study of UFOs, drawing a direct connection between UFOs that we see in the atmosphere and an extraterrestrial point of origin. And I think I've found two incidents that we can connect in that manner as a direct result of my research at the National Archives and my interview with Dr. Beatriz Villarroel. We're going to find out all the details about this research and my conclusions coming up right now. Good afternoon, alien enthusiasts, and welcome to another Angry Alien Bulletin. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about some of my own personal research, and to give you a little bit of a disclaimer from the beginning, some of the conclusions that I have come to personally as well. Again, I don't have an enormous amount of evidence to support my end conclusion in all of this, but I do have a lot of information that I have put together to come to this conclusion. So, of course, it's up to you as to whether or not you want to take me seriously. But what this has to do with is, number one, the research of Dr. Beatriz Villarroel, whom I recently interviewed, and number two, some footage that I found in the CIA files in the National Archives. UFO footage that has been featured before, once I actually saw it, but never in this kind of detail. What I managed to get at the National Archives was very, very high quality, at least given the low quality of the footage in general. It turned out to be much better than any other version of this footage that I had seen in the past. Footage that was captured by a member of the U.S. military in 1952 in Utah, whereas the research of Dr. Beatriz Villarroel was carried out in 1950. But interestingly enough, we're talking about two sets of unidentified objects, one grouping in space and one grouping in the atmosphere, possibly at high altitude. 9 objects in both cases. And what I'm going to share with you today is how similar these groupings turned out to be and how 9 objects in geosynchronous orbit that showed up in the plates at the Mount Palomar Observatory in 1950 could have appeared in the way that they did in the 1952 footage that I'm going to be showing to you. In my opinion, these objects are one and the same, or at the very least, further research needs to be done to determine whether or not these objects might be one and the same. Because given the general brightness, the general size of the objects that were described in the Utah footage, and the brightness of the objects that were seen in the Mount Palomar plates, and the distance between the two incidents, in my opinion, these are the same objects, or they very well could be. And it's an immense coincidence, in my opinion, given how many UFO sightings there have been, and given how many UFO photographs that have been taken over the years, how much UFO footage that we have. Very seldom have we seen anything involving 9 objects. As a matter of fact, it's almost unheard of. And yet here we are. 2 incidents involving 9 unidentified objects separated by a mere 2 years. One of these encounters taking place in geosynchronous orbit, and the other taking place in the atmosphere. And if further research indicates that these very well could be the same objects, I think that that is a huge breakthrough in our efforts to identify the point of origin for these vehicles. Because if they are the same objects, then clearly we are dealing with extraterrestrial technology. But enough talk about this topic. Let me go ahead and present my evidence. You can come to your own conclusions. Okay, first of all, we're going to talk about the sighting in the atmosphere in Utah. On July 2nd, 1952, at 11 a.m. on a bright, clear morning, Warrant Officer Delbert C. Newhouse, accompanied by his wife and 2 children, aged 12 and 14, was driving along the open highway a half dozen miles from Tremonton in northern Utah. Shortly thereafter, he testified to his Navy superiors, quote, "My wife noticed a group of objects in the sky that she could not identify. She asked me to stop the car and look. There was a group of objects that bore no relation to anything I had seen before, milling about in a rough formation and proceeding in a westerly direction. I opened the luggage compartment of my car and got my camera out of the suitcase. Loading it hurriedly, I exposed approximately 30 feet of film. There was no reference point in the sky, and it was impossible for me to make any estimate of speed, size, altitude, or distance. Toward the end, one of the objects reversed course and proceeded away from the main group. Keep that detail in mind. I held the camera still and allowed the single one to cross the field of view, picking it up again and repeating for 3 or 4 passes. By this time, all of the objects had disappeared." He also wrote to Project Blue Book, and an air intelligence officer interviewed Newhouse and learned that at relatively close range, before Newhouse could start filming, the UFOs appeared flat and circular, shaped like 2 saucers, one inverted on top of the other. The witness explained to the intelligence officer that he had heard no sounds, seen no exhaust or wake effects emanating from the objects. Before, during, nor after did planes, birds, balloons, or other recognizable phenomena appear in the unidentified aerial object viewing area. He restated that the one unknown, which took off on its own, pursued a course opposite to the original one and to the flight path maintained by the remainder of the group. Newhouse was convinced that the light from the objects resulted from reflection and that they were as long as they were wide and thin, in other words, disc-shaped. Delbert Newhouse, at the time of his sighting, had been graduated from the Naval Photographic School and was a veteran with 19 years service as a warrant officer, logging more than 1,000 hours on aerial photography missions and 2,200 as chief photographer. He was considered particularly reliable and a qualified observer. He had no implication in UFO research before his experience and made a sensible report, noting, for example, that evaluation of distances was impossible from the film because no reference point could be filmed together with the objects. He stated in a 1956 interview with the Air Force, quote, "Toward the end, one of the objects reversed its course and proceeded away from the rest of the group. I held the camera still and allowed this single object to pass through the field of view, picking it up later in its course. I turned, swinging the camera just in time to see the rest of the group disappear over the western horizon." And he added, quote, "I've studied the film and I'm very disappointed. The film falls far short of what I saw with the naked eye due to the delay of getting the camera going and to my error in exposure. If I had had that camera on the seat beside me, loaded and ready to go, there would be no need for questions. The Air Force would have the answer. That they were a bright, silvery color, a metallic appearance. They appeared to be made out of some kind of polished metal. In other words, something that would be extremely reflective were the objects to be filmed in orbit." Now, the film was taken quite seriously by both the U.S. Air Force and the Navy. The Air Force and Navy were convinced enough about Newhouse's credibility to spend considerable time and money on the analyses and to classify this film as top secret. The Air Force conducted a first analysis at the Wright Field, home of the ATIC, the Air Intelligence, and home also of Project Blue Book. The analysis concluded that the objects were not balloons or aircraft, and most unlikely to be birds. Captain Ed Ruppelt, who I've quoted many times in my videos in the past, head of Blue Book, and Major Dewey Fournay, liaison officer between Blue Book and the Pentagon, were convinced enough by the analysis to decide that the film, together with the Nick Mariana filming, which by the way is in reference to another film that I found at the archives, but we'll talk about that in another video, should be presented before a panel of scientists so that they examine their collection of best evidence that there are real UFOs and not just trivial phenomenon. The U.S. Navy Photo Interpretation Laboratory at the Navy's Anacostia facilities performed a second analysis as the Air Force asked them for a second opinion. The team had expended approximately 1,000 man-hours of professional time in the preparation of graph plots of individual frames of the film showing apparent and relative motion of objects and variation of their light intensity. Because the analysts noted the complete absence of any evidence to indicate birds, such as fluttering, birds were the first and easiest discarded explanation. There was almost a complete consensus that birds could not be the explanation. It was so untenable that the analysis concentrated on reasonable other possible causes, such as balloon or aircraft. And by the way, the reason that birds is so heavily focused on in this particular report is because eventually that's what Project Blue Book would conclude that these objects were years later. It was the opinion of the PIL representatives that the objects cited were not birds, balloons, or aircraft, but were not reflections because there was no blinking while passing through 60 degrees of arc and were therefore self-luminous. Plots of motion and variation in light intensity of the objects were displayed. But then later on, a panel of scientists got an opportunity to see the footage, and you're going to be shocked as far as their conclusions are concerned. It's called the Robertson Panel. Blue Book asked that a first evaluation panel composed of qualified scientists look at their best evidence before they would have a larger and official public panel look at it. The CIA took charge of the organization of this panel, which is why this footage ended up in the CIA's files at the archives, led by scientist H.P. Robertson, chosen by the CIA. The panel studied the film, ATIC's interpretation, and received a briefing by representatives of the U.S. Navy Photo Interpretation Laboratory on their analysis of the film. While the panel members were impressed by the evident enthusiasm, industry, and extent of the effort of the PIL team, they started to look for flaws and loophole in the unspoken conclusion that the film was evidence of extraterrestrial spacecraft. The astronomer of the panel found that an incorrect procedure was used by the Navy in their densitometer use. It was decided that the Navy would rerun the tests, but this has never been done, and it's still impossible to know if this erroneous procedure would have affected the results. But Dr. Thornton Page, another member of the panel, said that the objects look like seagulls. Ignoring the two analyses and the witness description of flying saucers when they were closer and before he could start filming, his argument was simply that he saw seagulls where he lives, and it was a similar sight to the images that he saw on the film. And this became the conclusion of the panel. The panel then recommended that the public should be educated so that they lose any interest in UFOs, and when Ed Ruppelt wanted to give a copy of the film to the press, it was absolutely vetoed by the Pentagon. Soon afterwards, Ed Ruppelt resigned from Project Blue Book. He published his memoirs a few years later, and then in 1960, at the age of 37, he died of a heart attack under mysterious circumstances. Over a decade later, when the infamous Condon Report came to the conclusion that UFOs were all either frauds or hoaxes or mundane objects, misidentified natural phenomena, something along those lines, and that there were no cases of any sort of significance that could be regarded as unidentified or possible extraterrestrial spacecraft, the CIA once again was involved in providing the photographic analysis of the footage that you're watching right now. And even though government agencies like the military or the CIA were not supposed to be involved in the Condon Report or in their conclusions, I have proof that the CIA was actually involved in this analysis and that their analysis was covered up, that it was made very clear that the CIA's involvement would not be made available to the press or to anybody else. The memoir for that particular part of this mystery is right here, and I also have a link in the description with a much more in-depth report on this footage and the whole mystery behind it. This case remains one of the most compelling pieces of evidence in existence for the validity of the whole UFO phenomenon. But now I'd like to turn your attention to a study entitled Exploring 9 Simultaneously Occurring Transients on April 12, 1950. And this came out in 2021, published by Dr. Beatriz Villarroel and her associates. Quote, 9 point sources appeared within half an hour on a region within 10 arc minutes of a red-sensitive photographic plate taken in April 1950 as part of the historic Palomar Sky Survey. Keep in mind, 10 arc minutes is a tiny region of space, 1/6 of 1 degree. All 9 sources are then absent on both previous and later photographic images and absent in modern surveys, which go several magnitudes deeper than the Mount Palomar Observatory could. Deep CCD images are provided with the 10.4 meter Grand Telescopio Canarius reaching brightness down to magnitude 26, and yet there is no sign of these objects in subsequent images from Mount Palomar or in modern images either. In other words, these things disappeared in a half-hour time frame of being observed. That's something that cannot be duplicated by natural phenomena like flaring dwarf stars, fast radio bursts, gamma ray bursts, or micro-lensing events. Other phenomena like passing asteroids aren't an explanation either, because they would have created streaks on the time exposure photographs, not these beautiful pinpoints of light. However, there's one object out of these 9 that is a bit unusual. It actually does streak slightly. It is the purple circled object almost at the center of the image, right there. this one object also vanishes, but it's not a fine pinpoint of light like the rest of them. Instead, the object creates a small streak across the exposure plate, indicating that it might have been in motion in a slightly different manner from the rest of them. Remember the one object that behaved differently from the others in the Utah footage? And this is not unusual behavior with UFOs that were spotted in the 1950s, with one object moving differently as if it might have been in command of the others.
There seems to be no fixed pattern of flight in cases where more than one or two discs have been reported. But several persons have said that in group flights, one of the discs seems to be of a distinct color, indicating, possibly, that this off-colored disc was the monitor or the control disc for the others.
But the one thing that I find to be the most compelling about these two cases when you compare them to one another is how the objects are grouped. In the atmosphere, of course, there seemed to be a fair amount of spacing between the objects, but still they were moving as a single formation. And assuming that the objects were actually flying in geosynchronous orbit, therefore moving in concert with the stars around them and not creating any streaks on the time exposure photograph, they would have to be very tightly grouped indeed, given the fact that they would be tens of thousands of kilometers away from Earth. And they are. All 9 objects are gathered together in the same little patch of sky that is no more than 10 arc minutes across, or 1/6 of a degree. That means that all of these objects would have to be extremely tightly packed from the perspective of an observer on the ground. In addition, if we're only talking about reflected sunlight, if that's the only way that these things were being observed at distance, that would mean that the objects could not be visible to the naked eye if they were in geosynchronous orbit. And that's the case with these objects as well. These little points of light are not visible to the naked eye, but only visible to a telescope capable of resolving objects down to magnitude 20, like the Mount Palomar Observatory and similar telescopes. But in my opinion, the most compelling case for these objects being the same 9 objects in orbit as were observed in this footage, is because 9 objects are a very unusual number for UFO sightings, but not unheard of. Of course, the most well-known example of a 9-object sighting is the 1947 sighting by Kenneth Arnold near Mount Rainier, which also involved 9 blue glowing objects. So within a 5-year time period, we have 3 very credible reports of 9 unidentified objects flying in the same formation. 2 of these encounters have visual footage associated with them, and 1 took place in space. So once again, admittedly, I don't have an enormous amount of evidence to confirm that these encounters involve the same objects, other than the fact that of all the UFO encounters, photographs that have been taken, footage, etc., a tiny percentage of them involved 9 objects. Not 10, not 8, but 9. And interestingly enough, we also have 9 objects appearing simultaneously in a very small patch of sky in 1950. Coincidence? Well, maybe, but once again, I find the odds against a coincidence to be pretty damn overwhelming. But what will help, and what I'm going to ask of Dr. Villarol, hopefully she can assist me with all of this, is whether or not the objects in the footage could be the same objects as the ones that were in geosynchronous orbit. Given the size of the objects described, given the time of day that they were filmed, given the relative distance between the 2 encounters, could they be the same objects? It'll probably be a little difficult to come to any sort of solid conclusion because satellites in geosynchronous orbit can have widely varying magnitudes depending on how much sunlight happens to be striking them at any given time and how reflective they are, that sort of thing. But nevertheless, in my opinion, given the brightness of the objects in the Palomar plates, once again, not visible to the naked eye, but very consistent with satellites or metallic objects in geosynchronous orbit, given what we have there, and also given the relative brightness of objects that are much, much closer, perhaps at 5 or 10,000 meters in altitude, something along those lines, I don't find it far-fetched at all to theorize that these very well could be the same objects. Once again, I freely admit that I could be wrong, but frankly, I think I'm right, because this is not the only one of these coincidences. In addition to that, as I've reported before, the so-called triple transient, 3 objects, again, relatively dim magnitude-wise, but closely clustered, detected in 1952, the day before the mass sighting of UFOs in Washington, D.C. in the summer of 1952. That also, in my opinion, is no coincidence. And if those 2 events are related, in my opinion, these other events could also very well be related. Again, an enormous coincidence, given all of the UFO footage we have over the years, to have 9 objects corresponding to another event involving 9 objects separated by only 2 years. And again, the significance of all of this, well, it sets a clear connection between objects in space, unidentified objects, that is, in space, and objects here on Earth. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe. And also, please check out the merchandise. It's available until the 26th of this month, at which time there's going to be some shuffling taking place in terms of the types of items that will be offered. As you can see, I'm wearing the I Told You UFOs Are Real piece of merch right now. This continues to be one of our more popular items, but the Oumuamua design, that one might be going away by the 26th. So don't miss your opportunity here. It's an incredible design from Sunline, who, by the way, just a fantastic organization in Texas. They do such a good job, far better than anybody else I've ever worked with as far as merch is concerned. I'm really grateful to all of them. So make sure to check that out. Or if you don't have the money to spend on something like that, I totally understand. Consider supporting this channel on Patreon for as little as $3 a month. And I'm going to be giving away 2 shirts, one to a random Patreon supporter and one to a random Super Chat supporter, also by the 26th of this month. Thanks again for watching, and as always, stay angry about space.